Hello, and welcome back to Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. In this video, we'll be talking about some of the very basic history of and understanding of inheritance. And I'm referring specifically in this case to genetic inheritance. Now, if you think back hundreds of years ago, people understood that there was something being passed on from parents to offspring. This was true long before they knew anything about genes or anything about DNA being the genetic material or anything like that. Well, why is that? How did we know that there was some sort of information being passed on from parents to offspring? Well, the answer is quite simple. If you look around, people tend to look like their parents or their kids. So familial resemblance is obvious, that we all the time see people say, oh, you look far more like your kids than you do relative to somebody else. Now, some of that could be that you're in a common environment. You live in the same house or in the same community as your parents do. However, we don't see as much resemblance in families when you have adoptees. We might have some, but quite often you can have adopted kids that don't look at all similar to their parents. They also may have very little correlation in other traits, such as dietary preferences or IQ, which is the intelligence coefficient, things like that. So how did people try to explain this? Well, Charles Darwin, attributed this familial resemblance to some unknown factor he referred to as a gemule. And there's a quote here, as you see on this slide, from a letter to Francis Galton. If I ask myself how you derive and where you place the innumerable gemules contained within the spermatozoa formed by a male animal during its whole life, note he said male, I cannot answer myself. Now, actually, there was some information at this point about genetic inheritance from the famous pea experiments by Gregor Mendel. However, Darwin did not know about these. Now, it's important to understand genetics, and it would have been actually very helpful for Darwin to understand genetics to help us understand the process of evolution as well. There's something that comes out if you don't really understand genetics that becomes a problem for evolution. So let's look at this. Imagine that you had some tall individuals in a population and some short individuals in a population. And let's say that offspring were always intermediate to the two parents. So if you have a tall parent, let's say somebody who's 6 foot, let's say a 6 foot tall mom and a 5 foot tall dad, would you be 5'6"? Would you be exactly in the middle? Well, let's hypothesize that that was true for a minute. Or as in this picture right here, let's imagine that white flowers and red flowers gave rise to pink flowers. What would happen if this happened over time, over and over again? Eventually, everybody in the population is going to come back to some sort of average. Basically, you'll lose all variation in the population. This is referred to as the problem of blending inheritance. Let me give you a numerical example just to illustrate this point. Now, let's say, for example, there's some trait you're measuring. It can be, number of hairs on the second digit of your finger or something like that. And here's a set of individuals in generation 1 as depicted on this slide. So here's a dad who has 4, a mom who has 9, a dad who has 5, a mom who has 8, etc., etc. The range in that first generation is from 0 to 9, as you can see looking across all those numbers. Now let's say each of those pairs that I have put together have a kid. So what I've done is I've made the kid have an exactly intermediate number, 6.5, 7.5, exactly intermediate of the two parents. Now look at the range that you see in the second generation. Well, the range in the second generation is quite a bit smaller than the range in the first generation. It goes from 0 to 9 in the first generation and 2 to 7.5 in the second generation. You've lost a lot of variation in the population. Now this is just one generation. If you were to iterate this over and over again, you'll see the same process happening again. So here, what I've done is I've taken these two individuals here and had them have a kid, and these two individuals here have a kid, etc. So I'm basically using the same individuals here. I'm not manipulating the numbers in any way. And you can see here in generation 3, the new range is 2.75 to 7, which is smaller than the previous one. In the fourth generation, it's 2.875 to 6.375. If you iterate this over and over again, you lose all variation. If you don't have any variation, you can't have evolution by natural selection. Because if everybody's the same, then there's no heritable trait. There's no trait being inherited, which makes some individuals more likely to survive than others. This poses a problem for understanding evolution by natural selection. Now, one possible solution to this was tossed out. This was from Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So this idea that variation in some way needs to be created or renewed within populations for evolution to happen. So what Lamarck suggested is something along the lines of what's called the inheritance of acquired character. Inheritance of acquired character. Now this right here is a quote from Lamarck's writing. The idea here is that basically if you use something, it then can grow and then that gets passed on to offspring. So some anecdotal examples would be something like a blacksmith. Blacksmith is using their muscles all the time to work with their metal. They tend to have these big muscles, and if you look, kids of blacksmiths often have these big muscles too. Same sort of thing may have been suggested for giraffes, that in stretching to reach the leaves on the trees, they stretch their necks up, and somehow this use of the neck and stretching it actually gets it to be passed on to the offspring, so they then had offspring that had slightly longer necks. This was the idea that was tossed out. Darwin actually adopted this idea for gemmules in some of his later editions of On the Origin of Species. Now, you may know that this is not exactly correct, and I'll show you one case where I messed up. If you go back to my 10th grade high school class, my teacher, Mr. Bennett, asked some questions. He said, if you were to cut someone's left arm off and they have kids, would they have 1 or 2 arms? That was one question on a quiz. The next question is, if you were to cut someone's left arm off and cut their kid's left arm off, repeating for 20 generations, would the 21st generation kid have 1 or 2 arms? Well, I got the first one correct because I said the answer was 2. Because just because you lose an arm, there's plenty of people who lose an arm and have kids with 2 arms. But somehow I thought maybe this would get passed on if this happened over and over again. And this is much more along the lines of what Lamarck had believed. Now, that is not true. In fact, if you were to cut somebody's left arm off and repeat that for 20 generations, 21st generation kid would still have 2 arms. Now the reason for this, and the reason that variation is not in fact lost, the way I portrayed it in the context of blending inheritance, is because we have particulate inheritance. We are actually transmitting bits of genetic information that remain distinct in the offspring. We'll talk about this much more extensively in the next lecture, exactly how this works. But just to put a couple of points on this, we are not a simple copy of our parents, nor are we necessarily the midpoint of our parents. It is quite possible to have 2 tall parents have a short kid, or 2 short parents have a tall kid, irrespective of any sort of environmental or dietary effects, anything like that. You can also have blue-eyed offspring from brown-eyed parents. This is very frequently observed. And basically, traits can be masked. It's because these particulate inheritance pieces can be masked by other parts. Also, genetic diseases can crop up, or just new traits in general. It doesn't have to be disease. Now, all of this was known long before, very long before we knew that DNA carried this genetic code. And a lot of this comes back to this fellow here, Gregor Mendel, that we'll talk about in much more detail in the next set of lectures. Now, I do want to stress one point, that inheritance is actually similar across most animals and many plants and even fungi. Now, many species are diploid. This is a very important word for you to know. Diploid means that you have 2 copies of the entire genetic code in your body, right? You have one gene copy that came from one parent, and you have another gene copy that came from the other parent. Okay? Now, you're not intermediate, but you actually have these 2 distinct, complete sets of gene copies for every gene in your whole genome. Now, this is true not just for you, but again, for most animals, many plants and fungi. And in fact, many of the same proteins and structures are involved in inheritance in you as in various plants and fungi, and as well as other animals. And it's because of this that people tend to use model organisms to understand inheritance. When I say model organisms, these are animals or plants that people work with, or fungi as well, that people work with to try to understand genetics. But we're not necessarily interested in them themselves, but we're using them to understand genetics more broadly because we presume that it applies very similarly across all species. So many of you know, for example, the famous fruit fly. People don't work on fruit flies because they love fruit flies or especially care about fruit flies or want to kill fruit flies. They use it because they're easy to work with in the laboratory. Same sorts of things for mouse, for xenopus frogs, for zebrafish, for this plant right here is called Arabidopsis thaliana. So this is why people use model organisms, because patterns of inheritance and the genes involved in inheritance tend to be the same across most living species. Now let me just give you an idea of what's to come. Foreshadowing. So these are some questions to be thinking about. I'm not asking you them just now. So how do offspring get the genes from their parents? Basically, how do these single copies of all the genes in the genome from your dad and from your mom come together and fuse into what becomes your genome? And are traits controlled by one gene alone? Is there a single eye color gene? Is there a single diabetes gene? Is there a single cancer gene? Things like that. Or are there many genes that contribute to these traits? And you can probably guess the answer to that one. It's the second. And finally, and this is again what I hope to be getting to you by the end of the genetics section, how do we find genes associated with traits? So we'll come back to these points, and I hope you'll join us. Thank you very much.